2 Samuel chapter 8. 2 Samuel chapter 8. In our Bibles, working our way through 2 Samuel, we are going to continue to see David's kindness, David's military victories in chapter 10, his kindness to Mephibosheth in chapter 9, and then chapter 11 and 12, it's going to start getting rough for David because he sins with by murdering Uriah and committing adultery with Bathsheba, and the rest of his life is going to be plagued because that's God's discipline or judgment upon his acts. Since he has caused trouble for one family, he says the sword will not depart from your family. And we'll see some of those things that happen in David's life in the coming weeks. But tonight we're in chapter 8. David rules his neighbors. That's what I've titled this because it's a testimony of how God gave him victory, military victory, to all the people around him. And so, do we have PowerPoint? If you don't have it up, that's okay. But I know Todd. I think it's up there, but we'll see. The joyous heights of chapter 7. You guys remember that? Chapter 7, the end of chapter 7, where he just praises God for what God has said he would do for him. Those joyous heights of chapter 7 give way to the bloody campaign of real life. Back to earth, so to speak, in chapter 8. God promised to give David unimagined blessings, but these blessings would not come, they would not become a reality by simply rubbing a lamp. Chapter 8 is going to detail for us a number of battles that David won. God gave him the victory in these battles. So all of these blessings, many of these blessings, I'll say, that God has promised to David is not going to come through ease. It's not going to come just by God granting something and it automatically happened. David is going to have to fight many battles. There were many battles. So there is a catalog in verses 1 through 8 of chapter 8. There is a catalog of victories. And you have the Philistines, the Moabites, Hadad-Dezer, the Arameans, all mentioned in verses 1 through 8. And then you have the mention of a king by the name of Toi, T-O-I. He is mentioned in verses 9, and he expresses his thankfulness in verse 10. And then there is the dedication in verses 11 and 12, and there we see the heart of David, and we see what he does with all the spoils, and who gives them all the spoils of war. And then we see in verses 13 and 14 influence, and then the last three verses, 15 through 18, the administration that's set up. So all of those are there for you, and we'll go through each one of these. The theme and the primary message of chapter 8 is this, and we see it in verse 6 and in verse 14. It is, and the Lord helped David wherever he went. You see that in verse 6, the last few words of verse 6. The Lord helped David, that is Yahweh, capital L-O-R-D. Yahweh, the God of Israel, helped David wherever he went. And you see it also in verse 14. And Yahweh, the God of Israel, helped David wherever he went. That's the primary message of chapter 8 that the reader is supposed to get at or to understand. That this is God granting David the victory. Now, it doesn't mean that David was all thumbs on the military battlefield. We know that he was not. He was a good strategist. He was a good fighter. But ultimately, Scripture communicates to us and wants us to know that it is God, not the military prowess of David, who grants David the victory in all of these situations, and that's what the writer intends for us to understand. So under David, the kingdom of Israel will expand, and it expands through the defeat of the Philistines to the west, in verse 1. the Moabites and the Edomites to the east in verse 2 and verses 13 and 14, and the Syrians to the northwest in verses 3 through 12. So, and the parallel passage to this is 1 Chronicles chapter 18. 1 Chronicles chapter 18 is nearly identical to 2 Samuel chapter 8. So we can begin looking at the catalog of victories in verses 1 through 8 here. It says, now after this, it is how the chapter begins, and after this indicates that there is a passage of time that has taken place. After what? After this, after God gave David, or Nathan communicated to David all that God was going to do with him, do to his house, build him a house. After this, there's a passage of time after all that happened. So what he's saying here is what follows took place after the events described in chapter 7. That's fairly obvious once we understand it's after these things took place. So here in chapter 8, a new episode is introduced. The essence is equivalent to it happened later on, or as the NIV says, in the course of time, or sometime later, or the ESV says, after this. How do I do that? With this? Did it work? Oh, there it is. It worked. I hear it beeping. That's pretty clever, by the way, you guys. You guys didn't see it up there, but back here I'm seeing you need to turn on the projector. That's pretty good. Okay, projector. Yeah, there it is. So now after this is sometime later. So we can walk through here and begin to look at it. And there you see is the outline, the first part of the outline where you see the catalog of victories. It's there. And then you see toy, submit, and then the next one is the second half of the outline from chapter 8. There it is. There's we've talked through all of that, so that's there. In talking to the catalog and talking about the catalog of victories, I wanted to show you. I don't know how clear that is, about as clear as mud, but you can see it's a map of Israel. All of the pinkish, reddish area there is the conquest of David. He is expanding. You can see to the north there, Aram, A-R-A-M. You can see that area up in there. That's the Arameans. That's where they're at. David defeats them up in that area. I'm not sure that you can see Damascus on this map. We'll see it on a different map coming up here. But let's walk through this one verse at a time. First of all, the Philistines. Now, we know that Israel fought with the Philistines frequently. They've been fighting with the Philistines ever since we began the book of 1 Samuel, studying that book. The chief city, you note that in verse 1, it came about that David defeated the Philistines and subdued them, and David took control of the chief city from the hand of the Philistines. The chief city is translated in some of the translations as Metheg Ammah. And Metheg Ammah is a literal translation of the Hebrew. It's that way in the NIV, and it's that way in the English Standard Version as well. The parallel passage in 1 Chronicles 18 and verse 1 doesn't have chief city. It has Gath. Gath being one of the principal cities in the Philistine territory. So if it's not Gath, then we really do not know what the chief city is, or what it was known, or where it was at. It's Metheg Ammah is unknown, and here is the only time in which we see it in the Bible. You may have a marginal note in your Bible that says that, but that's the chief city. Now, Metheg means bridle, and Ammah means 1 cubit. So the two English translations, the New American Bible and the New Jerusalem Bible, they leave the text blank. They don't even say anything. They don't even try. It is probable that the phrase is an idiomatic expression signifying a city of importance, or their capital city. So that's why you have in the New American Standard the chief city. The main city of importance is why it's there. The immediate context mentions defeat and subdue and take control. You see those words in verse 1, which conveys the sense of dominance. All those words do. Furthermore, after David, this we do know, that after David's time, the Philistines are never portrayed in the Old Testament as presenting a serious threat to Israel. After David passes off the scene for Solomon or any of the other kings that followed Solomon, the Philistines never posed a real threat after this. So if God gave David the victory over their chief city, he took the chief city, he no doubt established garrisons there and changed the whole landscape, put himself in a position where he had control, and the Philistines could not gain control later on. So therefore they were not a threat after the time of David. So he must have taken a significant ability away from them that rendered them a non-threat. The word subdue that she says he subdued them has the sense of domination and subjection. And then verse 2, he goes on, the writer goes on to discuss Moab. These people, Moabites, had opposed Israel since the days of Moses. Since the days of Moses, they had opposed Israel. All the way back in Numbers chapter 23 and Judges chapter 3. The ties, but there are strong ties, of course, between David and the Moabites. They were stronger than the Moabites and other Israelites because David's great-grandmother was what? Who was David's great-grandmother? Ruth. And Ruth was from the country of Moab. So there you can see the sections there, some of the countries. Ruth was from Moab. So there was a strong tie between David and the Moabites, stronger than anyone else in Israel, because his great-grandmother was Ruth. And if you remember in chapter 22 of 1 Samuel, the Moabites had helped David's family, helped provide a refuge for David's family. So there's some pretty strong ties there. Moab had really reached out and done David a favor, especially in this last regard, in providing his family for refuge. Nevertheless, the Moabite people were antagonistic, and David's commitment to God, that is, David's commitment to the Torah, was stronger than his family ties. And he chose to follow the Torah rather than following the family ties. Now, David did something, you can read it in verse 2. It's a long verse there. David did something completely unique to the defeated Moabites. Contemporary sentiment today would not allow such a treatment because it would be regarded as harsh. But here's what David had done to the Moabites. He had the POWs. Essentially, these were POWs. They were defeated men. They were required to lie down on the ground in 3 lines, 3 separate lines. 2 of the lines of men were put to death, and 1 line was spared. Which, in one commentator said, he has no idea, no explanation for why David did this to the Moabite people who gave his family refuge, and his great-grandmother was a Moabite. But for some reason, David thought that this was the wise thing to do, and we don't see in Scripture any correction or any chastisement from God at all about this. The parallel passage in 1 Chronicles chapter 18 and verse 2 does not mention any killing at all of the Moabite people. None at all. But just because 1 Chronicles doesn't mention it does not mean that we are to erase 2 Samuel chapter 8 and verse 2, because it's very clear right there. He measured 2 lines to put to death, 1 full line to keep alive. And the Moabites became servants to David, bringing tribute. So there, in spite of what we think about this, David showed grace to the Moabite people in this case. First, how so, you might ask? Well, first of all, some were allowed to live. Usually prisoners of war or people that you defeat in battle, you don't let them live. There were a couple of occasions where people groups were on the ban by God because of their gross immorality and their gross way of living. And so there was the instruction by God to wipe out everything so that they do not influence you. But here in this case, some were allowed to live. They were allowed to return home to their families. And secondly, none were sold as slaves. None were forced into a life of labor for a foreign master, which is very gracious of David. He could have done that. He could have sold them to another country as slaves. He could have put them to forced labor, but he did not do that. But he did reduce their ability to muster an army by having many of them put to death. Third, a portion, and David is smart in doing this, a portion of the harvest was supplied to Israel as a tribute. So they were allowed to go back home to be with their families. They were not forced slaves, but part of their harvest, part of their grain, part of the fruit of their labor was shipped to Israel to supply the Israelite people. That's the Moabites. Third, the third is mentions Hadad-ezer. In verse 3, he defeated him. The text says that David defeated him, the son of Rehob, king of Zobah, as he went to restore his rule at the river. David captured from him 1,700 horsemen and 20,000 foot soldiers, and David hamstrung the chariot horses, but reserved enough of them for 100 chariots. And when the Arameans of Damascus came to help Hadad-ezer, king of Zobah, David killed 22,000 Arameans. Then David put garrisons among the Arameans of Damascus, and the Arameans became servants to David, bringing tribute, and the Lord helped David wherever he went. That's where we have that statement. David took the shields of gold which were carried by the servants of Hadad-ezer and brought them to Jerusalem from Betah and from Berothai, cities of Hadad-ezer. King David took a very large amount of bronze. Hadad-ezer, the name means God is my helper. He is the king of Zobah in Syria. Syria is that area north. I'm going to go back one slide. And I'm not sure how to do that here. Okay. That just north of the area that's pinkish or reddish is that area right in there. That's the area of Syria. And David went into that area and defeated him. And he apparently ruled a region from Ammon in the south to the Euphrates in the east. David did. Now, according to the section that we're studying here, Hadad-ezer attempted to restore his power. And David engaged him in battle at the river Euphrates, and he defeated him. And when the Syrians came to his aid, the Arameans, David defeated them, and then he occupied Damascus. He killed 22,000 of them. Now, if you look in verse 3, it says, David defeated Hadad-ezer, the son of Rehob, king of Zobah, as he went to restore his rule at the river. Who is he? The nearest antecedent would be Hadadezer. The he could refer to either one of them. You have a plural, you have a masculine pronoun, and then you have two masculine proper nouns. So it could refer to either one of them. Most likely, and my thought is, most likely the reference is to David. And here's what seems to have happened. Evidently, David took his troops to the river, and that is the Euphrates River, not to the Jordan or to the Yarmouk River, which are in Israel there. And he did that to stake territorial claims. Well, why did he do that, to stake territorial claims? Because all the land east of Israel to the Euphrates had been promised to Israel back in Genesis chapter 15. Deuteronomy 1 and Deuteronomy 11. Saul had begun the expansion and the conquest back in 1 Samuel chapter 14 during the convoy. And David continues it. And so during the convoy out to establish territorial boundaries here, he encountered Hadadezer, who also claimed possession rights. And David won and captured 1,700 horsemen. 1,000, what does he say? 1,700 horsemen and 20,000 foot soldiers. In 1 Chronicles 18:4, it says 1,000 chariots and 7,000 horsemen. That's why we have in the number here 1,700. He had a huge, huge victory here. That's what he's doing. That's what he's doing out there. He's heading to that area. Now it says that David hamstrung all but 100 horses. And that hamstringing entails a simple operation. You can just, you can take a sword and just with one swing of the sword, you can hamstrung a horse. And what it does is it cripples them. They used to cripple oxen and horses. Genesis 49:6, they would cripple oxen, they would cripple horses, and what it means is they can't run. They can't run. The tendon. Do you know what a hock is? The hock on a horse. Start with the back feet, start at the bottom. The hoof. The next step is the ankle. It's just about this high above the hoof. There's the ankle, and the bone keeps coming up, and then you have a joint right there. That's the hock. And then you keep going up, and there's the tail right there. That tendon between the hock and the rear and the hind quarters, you cut the tendon right there, and coming off that big bone right there, there's a big tendon right there. You cut that, and they can't run. They can't pull anything. Pull a chariot, and they can't run. So you disable the horses. Can they still plow? Can they still be effective in carrying things and walking? I think so, but they can't be used for war. And so David, what he did was essentially reduce the threat of reprisal from them. He left 100 horses. He did not hamstring 100 of them, perhaps for their own protection against a small band of invaders and their people. Perhaps they could protect themselves, or for David's army, for him to take for himself. But the idea was to take away the future threat. Also, in David's mind, is Deuteronomy 17 and verse 16. We mentioned this morning, that a king of Israel was not to do what? He was not to accumulate a large army. He was not to accumulate a large number of horses. Because the tendency of human beings is to begin to lean on and depend upon those large number of horses for your strength rather than depend upon God. And so he captured 1,700 horsemen, 20,000 foot soldiers. There is quite a bit of reason there to boast, and David would not do that. So those are some of the reasons why he did what he did. In verse 5, it mentions the Arameans. The Arameans of Damascus, modern-day Damascus, they were part of the Syrian Federation. Hadadezer was part of all of this. They were under him probably, and they came to help Hadadezer, king of Zobah, it says in verse 5. However, like the army of Hadadezers, they experienced a crushing defeat. David killed 22,000 of them. And what we're talking about in this area here is the area between the Lebanon mountains and the anti-Lebanon mountains. There's a big valley right there that you can see. And that's where this took place. This is just, you see Israel to the south there, just to the south in the bottom corner. Then you have a mountain range that green's a mountain range, and the white in between that is a big valley, and that's where this battle took place. So in verse 6, we see that David has stabilized Aramea. Garrisons are to represent Israelite power, to stabilize the territory, and perhaps participate in government efforts. The first two, at that point, we see the first two of the thematic statements. The Lord helped David. God caused David to win the battles. That's what the writer wants us to understand. That's the character of our God that we should see through this, that God is able to give victory to his people, whether it's militarily or whether it's a spiritual battle. Our flesh and blood, our battles are not against flesh and blood, but against spiritual powers and forces in dark places. That's what Ephesians chapter 6 says. He's just as powerful on the battlefield as he is the spiritual battlefield. That's what we should understand and get through this, take from this. Verse 7, he collects a tremendous amount of gold for the future temple. And verse 8, a very large amount of bronze. All of this, of course, is going to contribute to the building of the temple when his son Solomon takes the throne after David has passed away. So the spoil from this victory was significant in two ways. First of all, the resources were enormous, and little doubt that they were used in the temple construction later. 1 Chronicles chapter 18, verse 8 mentions that. 2, Damascus was located on major highways when he took Damascus. The intersection, the two major roads in the ancient Near East called the Way of the Sea, and the other one is called the King's Highway. And Damascus is the intersection of these two main highways. They were the two major caravan routes connecting Asia with Africa, which is huge. That means so many things come through there. And if you study the Apostle Paul, that was his strategy as well. Paul went to Philippi, remember that, and he wrote the letter to the Philippians. The town of Philippi was a Roman retirement, a Roman soldier's retirement place. It was less than a mile square, but there was a major highway that connected Europe to the Middle East running through Philippi. That's why Paul went there. He had access to people traveling back and forth. Therefore, the gospel, people would hear the gospel, and perhaps they would take the gospel back home where they were at. That was his strategy. Not necessarily the biggest place, but the place that afforded him the maximum amount of communication and potential communication from where he was. So here you have Damascus. Now that David's in control of this, he's in control of two major caravan routes connecting Asia with Africa. And by controlling this location and stationing garrisons along the caravan route, Israel was able to collect revenues from itinerant merchants in exchange for safe passage on the roads. They were able to raise money for their building projects. And now in verses 9 and 10. Verses 9 and 10, this is Toi. This is a king by the name of Toi. Now when Toi, king of Hamath, heard that David had defeated all the army of Hadadezer, Toi sent Jerome, his son, to King David to greet him and bless him, because he had fought against Hadadezer and defeated him. For Hadadezer had been at war with Toi, and Jerome brought with him articles of silver, of gold, and of bronze. David also dedicated these to the Lord with silver and gold that had been dedicated from all the nations which he had subdued, from Aram to Moab to the sons of Ammon and the Philistines and Amalek, and from the spoils of Hadadezer, son of Rehob, king of Zobah. So Toy is expressing his thankfulness in verses 9 and 10. David's victories in the north, the central part of the Lebanon Valley, the modern Baca Valley. You've heard that term, I'm sure. Hearing of David's victories prompted Toy, king of Hamath, to favorable relations, to peaceful relations rather than an adversarial one. It's been suggested that Toy may have been a vassal of Hadadezer, but the text plainly says that Hadadezer had been at war with Toy. It says in verse 10. Therefore, in this case, this king demonstrates his approval of David and at the same time makes his position well known by sending gifts via his son, Joram. And in 1 Chronicles chapter 18, verse 10, his name is Hadoram, which the H and the J could be, the Hebrew has no J sound. It's ha. It's ha. It's not a J sound. So that's why you would probably have the H in your English. Hamath was a city and district located about 125 miles north of Damascus on the Orontes River. Lebanese territory is further alluded to. We're going to see it in chapter 24 of 2 Samuel. We'll see more statements about Lebanese territory. And Solomon will later expand his influence into this area as well. So as a result of these victories, they receive more gifts, more blessings. Again, God is causing all of this to happen. He's putting in the hearts of all of these people, these neighbors, to be favorable toward David and toward Israel. And we read in verses 11 and 12 the dedication. And here we see the heart of David. This is a great statement about David. A statement that you and I would wish would be mentioned about us. It says in verse 11, notice, he dedicated all these things to the Lord with the silver and gold that he had dedicated from all the nations which he had subdued. And then it names the nations in verse 12. Beloved, you and I know that there are few temptations are as intense as the appeal to the flesh as money. Gold, in whatever form it is, has always appealed and has always been a stumbling stone for man. Man has lost his life going after gold, has forfeited his own soul going after gold. And there are, perhaps with the exception of women, speaking of men in particular, with the exception of women, gold no doubt ranks first place as historically having the ability to stumble, cause a man to stumble. Money means power, influence, and it means you can escape. I don't have to deal with stuff because I have money. I can hire it done. I can run whatever. Well, during these years, David came to possess a massive treasure during these years. Massive treasure. And here again is the mark of a man after God's own heart. We noticed the one last week, the mark of a man after God's own heart. Here we see another one. He dedicated these to the Lord. That's the man after God's own heart. He recognizes, he understands, he knows that all blessings come from God. They're God's. He dedicates them to the Lord. He's open to how the Lord would have him to use these things. That's a man after God's own heart. David was convinced that pleasing God had greater value than all the riches he could amass. And that is a huge statement. He was convinced that pleasing God had greater value here and in the next life than amassing all the riches that he possibly could. According to 1 Chronicles 22 and verse 14. In fact, if you just flip over there real quickly, 1 Chronicles 22:14. Note what it says. This is David preparing for the building of the temple. He says in verse 14, "Now behold, with great pains I have prepared for the house of the Lord 100 talents of gold and 1,000,000 talents of silver and bronze and iron beyond weight, for they are great in quantity. Also timber and stone I have prepared, and you may add to them." There's a statement just before David passes away. He's going to die very soon. In chapter 23, Solomon begins to reign. But that's a statement of how much David had accumulated in his life in preparing to build the temple. And they are, the amount is staggering. 100,000 talents of gold. That's approximately 7.5 million pounds. 7.5 million pounds of gold. Gold is what? $1,400 an ounce right now? $1,800 an ounce? This is 7.5 million pounds. And 1,000,000 talents of silver, approximately 75 million pounds of silver. Massive amount of stuff that David had accumulated. Massive amount of stuff. And it's beginning, we see the man who wrote this is recording and beginning to tell us how God granted that amount of wealth to David. It's through military victories and through the wise government and the wise management of resources that the Lord had provided for them. Verse 12 gives us the source of where they all came from. Nations, here you see the term nations. It's a reference to all the pagan peoples or nations in distinction from the Israelite people. And then verse 12, of course, names the nations. And then finally in verses 13 and 14, is the achieving and the maintaining. So here's the influence in verses 13 and 14. "So David made a name for himself when he returned from killing 18,000 Arameans in the Valley of Salt. He put garrisons in Edom, and all Edom he put garrisons, and all the Edomites became servants to David, and the Lord helped David wherever he went." So you have the achieving that you see in verse 14 and the maintaining, the achieving in verse 13 and the maintaining in verse 14. So David's victory consolidated his control over both southern Syria and the Transjordan area. How do I go back one? Is it possible? Yes. One more. Okay. The Transjordan area is the area to the, as you're looking at it, to the right or to the west of the Jordan River. And to the north, all of that section, all of that area, David consolidated all of that area. Moab, Ammon, Edom, Aram to the north. There were no threats. Philistines to the east or to the west. They were all subdued. In 1 Kings chapter 10 and beginning at verse 14, Solomon's reign is implicitly measured against the law, the Torah's standards for kings. And in each point of comparison, Solomon is weighed in the balance and found lacking. David, on the other hand, is subjected to similar tests in this passage here that we're studying, and he passes. Well, what's all that about? David neither accumulates large number of horses nor accumulates large amounts, a large army at this point. Like Solomon, David practiced polygamy, and yet the magnitude of Solomon's involvement in this practice, of course, dwarfs that of David's. So in achieving and maintaining, when you compare David with Solomon, Solomon comes out on the bottom side. He comes out lacking. He comes out wanting. He doesn't measure as high as David, because even though David had many blessings, and he did have large amounts of silver and gold that he accumulated for the building of the temple, Solomon seemed to let all these things get to him in a certain way that he became skeptical, and he began to try to find purpose and reason in life through the accumulation of things and work projects. And that's why we have the book of Ecclesiastes. Him journaling. I tried to recreate the Garden of Eden in chapter 2, and I found that all is vanity, all is futile. It's like soap bubbles. There's nothing new under the sun. No, in other words, you cannot have fulfillment and satisfaction under the sun apart from a relationship with God. It's impossible. I tried with money. I tried with women. I tried with building projects. I had wisdom beyond any man that's ever lived on the earth. And you cannot find satisfaction apart from a relationship with God. That's Ecclesiastes. And finally, the administration. Go to the last slide. Finally, the administration is given there for us in verses 15 through 8. You see there's a parallel passage in 1 Chronicles chapter 18. And there's the particular office is listed, and then there's the people or peoples that handled that administrative office. So it was not only, it's important, I think it's significant that we remember, it's not only the might. David was a great military man. David was also a great manager and shepherd of people. That's what God told him. David, I'm going to take you from shepherding sheep, and you're going to shepherd my people Israel. And he did it wisely. And so you have the accumulation that you see, and this is how the Lord gave it to him in chapter 8. Whew, a lot of battles here. A lot of fighting. But the key point, the key theme is in verse 6 and in verse 14. The Lord helped David wherever he went. God sustains, God provides, God answers prayers, God delivers. And he's still the same God today. You are just as much the object of his great love and his great grace and mercy as David was. The blessings you have are even greater than David's blessings that he possessed walking on this earth. That's how blessed you are. No one is going to take you out of God's hands. He is going to supply all of your needs. He always has. He always will. But when we start getting skeptical, when we start panicking under a certain circumstance and we run ahead of God, then we take ourselves and we put ourselves in a position where we should not be, where it's not wise to be. And we need to, life is a lesson of learning to live by faith, not by sight. Okay, any questions?